listening to a Tax Justice Network podcast covering the 10 worst global offenders identified by the Financial Secrecy Index in 2018. In fifth place is Singapore with a secrecy score of 67.13 out of 100 and over 4.5% of the global market. I'm Naomi Fowler, talking to the Tax Justice Network's John Christensen. Singapore is number 5 on the 2018 Financial Secrecy Index. A fairly high secrecy score of 67, accounting for a large and growing share, over 4% of the global market for offshore financial services. Who is using Singapore?
Yeah, well, you're right to say that Singapore has a large and growing share, and that, of course, reflects its geographical position, because geographically Singapore is really well placed to pick up new business coming from across Southeast and Southern Asia. Now, many Chinese wealth holders like to operate in that region, but they don't feel confident about operating through Hong Kong as a tax haven, because it's a little bit too close to China and under Chinese political control. And so instead they opt for Singapore. Similarly, you'll find that many wealthy Indians use Singapore, and that's especially the case since they no longer trust Switzerland. Swiss banking secrecy is being step by step broken open by the United States and others. So they're worried about using Switzerland. And of course, whilst traditionally Indians like to use Mauritius as well for shifting money offshore and then reinvesting back into India, there's been a change of the double tax agreement with Mauritius, which makes it a lot harder for Indians to hide their capital offshore. So they're using Singapore as well. And at the same time, you'll find that Singapore has become a regional hub for a lot of United States banks, British banks, Swiss and other European banks, wanting to operate in a politically stable but highly secretive financial hub. And that hub is located right there at the centre of the action, in other words, on the western rim of the Pacific Ocean. So this is where geography matters. And if you look, the vast majority of the banks operating in Singapore, that's over 95% of the commercial banks operating in Singapore, are affiliates of foreign banks. And that gives you an impression of how important Singapore has become as a regional hub. Singapore offers a whole range of special tax treatments to non-residents.
Right, and the Financial Secrecy Index points out that there are significant concerns posed by Singapore in terms of its threat to global economic stability. Why is that?
Well, it's slightly paradoxical, isn't it? Because if you look at Singapore as a nation state, a relatively new decolonised nation state, formerly a British colony, one of the things that really sticks out is its political stability. The same party's held power there since 1959, would you believe? And at one level, that party is very social democratic in its orientation. You know, it's pretty much a throwback to the old British Labour Party, whose policies they adopted. But at the same time, this is the party that has introduced really strict financial secrecy laws. And several factors stick out and should be matters of particular concern to the tax justice movement. Firstly, Singapore allows trusts to be operated through what they call private trust companies, which permit a far higher degree of control by the trust settlers that is normal in trust law. So this is particularly attractive to Chinese people who evade tax and hide away their dirty money, but who feel rather uneasy about losing complete direct control over their assets. Secondly, Singapore has emerged as a major money laundering centre. One kind of physical manifestation of that is the Freeport. So it has got a terrible track record, frankly, for not tackling corrupt banks and not effectively tackling the money laundering that goes through the centre. And third and finally, Singapore has emerged as a major centre for what we call round-tripping capital. What we've seen is a transfer of Indian round-tripping away from Mauritius to Singapore, precisely because Indians actually feel more confident that Singapore will be able to resist global pressures to be more transparent.
So what's round-tripping? Why does it matter?
Round-tripping is enormous and no one seems to have heard about it. It matters enormously. It's become a huge issue in recent decades. Round-tripping happens when a wealthy person in, let's say, France or wherever, shifts her wealth to an offshore company in other words, in a different jurisdiction, which doesn't disclose the details of the ownership, and then returns the wealth to France, making it appear that this money is foreign direct investment. Easy peasy. Now, what's the upside of that for the person in France? Well, it means that she's shifted a whole load of capital offshore and brought it back, dressed up as foreign direct investment, which of course attracts all sorts of tax breaks and maybe subsidies and all sorts of things. But in fact, the capital originates from France.
Right. Tell us about some of Singapore's other tax offerings.
So, as one would expect of any tax haven, firstly, there's no capital gains tax, there are no gift taxes, no estate taxes, all the things that really wealthy people are looking for. Non-residents, in other words, people who don't actually live in Singapore, are fully exempted from tax on foreign-sourced income, which is received in Singapore, a bit like the British domicile rule. Wealthy residents who receive foreign-sourced income but don't take that income, bring it back into Singapore. In other words, they keep it offshore. They receive full tax exemption on that income. So this is, a quasi what's known as a territorial tax system, in effect similar to the UK non-domicile rules. And that's the type of thing that attracts really wealthy people, the multi-millionaires and billionaires, to Singapore, because that package means no wealth taxes, no capital gains taxes. They can hold their incomes offshore and effectively remove themselves entirely from paying tax. Of course, Singapore also has a whole raft load of double taxation agreements with other countries, which makes it very attractive to people wanting to engage in round tripping and so on. So it's got all the standard tax exemptions that the really wealthy people are looking for.
Okay, and if we have a look at the international agreements, Singapore has signed the OECD's Common Reporting Standard back in 2001, so it's quite a long time ago. This relates to the automatic exchange of information with other countries, which seems like it would be a relatively good thing.
Yeah, of course, it is a good thing, but we've got to be cautious about this, because what we're seeing is that tax havens are signing up to agreements with no intention of actually ever complying with them in any proper sense of the term. So Singapore is gradually bringing in provisions for better cooperation on tax information exchange. I mean, first of all, the Common Reporting Standard is a multilateral measure, but it allows far too much scope for tax havens to choose which countries they will share information with.
And we've seen many of the top 10 global offenders being very selective about who they're going to share information with through these processes.
Exactly. So they'll share information with powerful nations, the OECD states, but they won't with the developing countries. Secondly, Singapore and many other British common law tax havens allow trusts, and trusts are particularly secretive offshore mechanisms. They are highly susceptible to abuse by tax evaders. So that's another important part of their tax haven characteristic. And third, Singapore has this really deep-rooted culture of offshore secrecy. It runs right the way through the population. They all buy into this tax haven Singapore model. And although a new law was adopted in September 2014, which makes it a criminal offence for asset managers and bankers to willfully conceal foreign tax offences, this probably won't change the culture that much, and not least, and this is where the suspicious nose comes in, not least because the courts will struggle to prove that word willful. Willfulness is very difficult to prove in court.
The effect of one word. And how about developments in terms of the banking secrecy laws? How are they doing there?
Yeah, now about 20 years ago, the Singaporean government took a conscious decision to liberalise its financial markets, the whole banking system, in order to attract more foreign banks. And at the same time, there was a lot of comment about how the city-state was positioning itself as the Switzerland of the Far East banking market. Everyone knew the Pacific Rim was emerging as the new global powerhouse. So the reputation for banking secrecy has been reinforced by a Banking Act adopted in 2001, which stresses almost complete secrecy and criminalised the disclosing of customer information. So classic tax haven stuff. Infringement of that Banking Act or of its provisions was made punishable by custodial sentences ranging up to 3 years. So that's quite a heavy custodial sentence. But I think in practice, the bigger deterrent lies with this small island culture of Singapore, which discourages dissent, discourages whistleblowing. By and large, everyone is, and we've seen many other tax havens, is discouraged from rocking the boat in any sort of way. And there are all sorts of subtle ways in which that can be enforced. So I wouldn't be too optimistic about the new provisions, whether it's for automatic information exchange or criminalising bankers that support tax evasion. Proving willfulness to conceal is going to be a very steep climb for any court of law.
Right. And let's go back to trusts, because, as they say, the trusts are the new black. And trust laws in 2004 were amended to make them more useful to Europeans in particular in avoiding and evading inheritance taxes. And quite popular there is the private trust company, which acts as a trustee for secretive trusts. So tell me about that.
Yeah, now trusts are important. Trusts come out of English common law, and they're widely used in offshore secrecy structures because they can so easily be used to avoid disclosing the identity of the settlors and the beneficiaries. The settler is the person who creates the trust. The beneficiaries are the people who benefit from the trust. It might be the same person, by the way. Now, typically, a trust is established when someone who owns an asset, let's say a large block of shares in a company, hands over the ownership of those shares and control over those shares to another person. That person is known as the trustee, who must look after the shares according to a previously agreed set of instructions from the settlor. So essentially you're handing over ownership and control. Now, not everyone is comfortable with handing over control and ownership of a big block of shares. So the Singapore government has made a provision in their trust law in 2014, which allows the settler to use a so-called private trust company to retain a far greater degree of control over the assets, which in practice obliterates this key feature of a trust, which is the separation of ownership and control from the original settler, the original owner. And it turns the trust into what lawyers and courts of law elsewhere would describe as a sham trust. This is not for real.
Let's talk about Freeport, because Singapore offers Freeport services. High net worth individuals can store all kinds of things, art, wine, gold, all exempt from duties and taxes, and the customs declarations are a little bit vague.
Yeah, this is a rather depressing story, because for most of us, works of arts are things you go and see in galleries, but sadly for the world of the banking sector and so on, works of arts are just another asset class. And valuable works of arts can easily be used as money laundering tools and traded as assets for people who are looking to either shift wealth from one place to another or to evade tax or whatever. So that's the starting point. And works of art have become a favourite asset class for the high net worth individuals. They're widely seen as a safe investment. They don't tend to drop in value that much, and they can be stored offshore in tax-free environments, which provides escape for taxes on wealth, estate taxes, capital gain taxes, stamp duties, and even customs duties. And that's where the free ports come in. And the Singapore Art Freeport, which is owned and operated by a guy called Yves Bouvier, a Swiss person who owns similar facilities in Luxembourg and in Switzerland. It's one of the world's bigger Freeport facilities. It provides everything that they're looking for. It's an almost fail-safe way of storing wealth and trading wealth on the international markets. So let's say you have a work of art, a Picasso painting, which is valued at, let's say, 50 million. That work of art will belong to a company, maybe a British Virgin Island company, and all you have to do to trade it on the international markets is to exchange the shares of that BVI company. No one will actually need to move the work of art, but you've just shifted 50 million from one account to another, completely out of sight of any authorities whatsoever, because all that's happened is that share ownership has changed hands.
OK, let's go back to the round tripping that's going on, because Singapore is really of big concern to many countries. This is a big issue.
I think the vast proportion, a vast majority of global wealth has been shifted offshore and is round-tripped constantly. But you speak to the World Bank and speak to the IMF, and they have no figures for this. But of course, it's all hidden behind offshore companies. So we have no idea of the global scale of this round-tripping problem. But some examples might hint at the importance of this phenomenon. For example, for many years, the largest source of foreign direct investment to India was Mauritius. And that's because Indian capital owners had shifted their wealth thanks to a double tax agreement between India and Mauritius, which is a tiny little tax haven just off the coast of Africa. That allowed them to shift their wealth from India to Mauritius, where its ownership could be hidden behind Mauritius registered shell companies, and they get back to India and got all the tax breaks and everything. And the same with the Chinese. Chinese wealth holders for several decades have been using the British Virgin Islands, of course in the Caribbean. They register companies there, they shift their wealth offshore, hide it behind these shell companies in the British Virgin Islands, and it returns to China from the BVI dressed up as foreign direct investment with all the tax breaks. But not just the tax breaks, it means that no one actually knows who owns the capital. So very corrupt officials and business people have been doing this for decades with relative impunity from investigation.
And they changed the law in Mauritius, and so that's why that money is now round-tripping through Singapore back to India?
Yeah, what happened was that under great pressure, internal pressure, including demonstrations, I attended a demonstration in Delhi myself about corruption in India. It's become a major political issue. Under pressure from the street, literally from the street, the Indian government renegotiated the double tax agreement with Mauritius, making it a lot less easy for wealthy Indians to hide their money in Mauritius. And so, of course, they all looked elsewhere, and Singapore was the place they chose.